So hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. As we had stated, my name is Dane Wagner. I'm co-founder and CPO of Semeta Behavior Science, which used to be Blackhawke Behavior Science. Blackhawke is the research laboratory that was founded back in a couple universities about 6-7 years ago. And now we are Semeta Behavior Science. Now, today I want to share with us the journey that we kind of went on, which is around leveraging and describing human capital traits. Human capital traits are pretty important things because they dictate our everyday behaviors and our everyday actions, even those that we maybe haven't been exposed to in the past. I'm sure many of us have heard and understood the idea of, one moment, sorry, I'm getting ready to share my screen here. So let me go ahead and do that. Sharing screen now. And we're going to share that. And nope. Why is that not happening? There we go. That's what I wanted. Share. All right. Do we see my Semeta Prevent, Predict, Propel?
Look good.
Yes, sir.
Excellent. All right. So picking up where I left off. These human traits predict everything that we may or may not do in the future, essentially. Just a question. Has anybody here taken something like the MBTI before? Or maybe the Hogan assessments or some other kind of personality assessment kind of thing? Some of us, right?
Like a while ago, but
yeah,
yeah,
it's pretty common, and a lot of us take them because they're sort of fun to do. It's just might as well do it. Others, if we come from a more corporate background, we may have had to take them for like team building exercises and things like that. But the vast majority of them, when you get your results, they don't mean anything, right? They're kind of vague descriptors of what might be true, and some of it's like, yeah, that's there. Some of it's like, I don't really agree with that. It's hit and miss, and this is because a lot of those measurements, they start in a good place, a psychological foundation, but they aren't hitting everything that they need to hit. They don't have the depth that they need to have. And that's what I really want to talk about, is that depth, the actual traits that underlie things such as our personality and other areas. So let's dive into that. First, human capital, as I described, is strongly the particular predictors that we see that show us what we're going to do. And these can be described as our styles of thinking, our styles of working, our plasticity, which is really just grit, what drives us to do, behave, act, think how we do, as well as our interactions with other members. And these traits can be very specific or somewhat vague at the same time. The specific ones, though, are the ones that help the most in all applications. So here's a couple of those traits. And right now in the research, we see that there's well over 3,000 different traits that have been identified. But the truth is, most of those traits are not as useful as all the rest. So these here are just some of those 45 traits that, for instance, we at Semeta have identified as being particularly helpful in the entrepreneurial ecosystem. Some traits are a little more helpful after being an entrepreneur, post-IPO. Some are more helpful during different phases as well. So in ideation, for instance, some of these traits are a little bit more helpful than others. But as you read through these, you might realize that some of these are words that maybe have been described for you in the past. They might have been compliments or comments about your performance. You may have heard somebody say, "Wow, really empathetic, aren't you?" Or, man, I wish I was as resilient as you were. Or, wow, they're so charismatic, right? These are all traits that others pick up on and describe your performance or your actions with. So we should be doing the same for ourselves. But what's key is being able to identify our levels within these as we go forward. And that's kind of the goal of that assessment that I've opened up to all of us here, is that that assessment will measure about 45 of these specific traits and help us understand them a little further. But let's talk about why that's actually important here, right? First is that context matters, right? We have a couple of different worlds that we live in. And in the entrepreneurial ecosystem, we are vastly dynamic, right? There's a lot of changes that happen every day. Some are predictable, some are not. And as we progress through our careers, the same thing occurs time and time again, where we will find ourselves in new contexts and having to adapt to those contexts, whether it's the social contexts, that context of which we're interacting with people, or the environmental context, that context which is the physical space that we live in. In fact, back after 2020, we saw that a lot of that context shifted, right? We shifted into a virtual space working through our computers. And this meant that work dynamics had to change as well. The way that we hired people changed as well. And we should be thinking about that real case scenario where we can constantly look and say, hey, based on the environmental context, we've had to shift what we're looking for. Based on the social context, we've had to shift what we've looked for to be successful in how we work in our day-to-day lives. So ultimately, this union is called person-context fit. And person-context fit is really just about striving to find which human capital traits specifically help in which specific contexts. Now, the most common person-context fit that we struggle with is the workplace, specifically in teams. Now, as entrepreneurs, we, of course, find that even if we are a quote-unquote solopreneur, we're still relying on other people to do things. We're still relying on partners, on maybe subcontractors and other individuals. But the vast majority of us are part of some sort of team. And when we're in a C-suite, that team dynamic is even more important because ultimately, it's not just one person that makes a decision. It's the collective body that has to come to terms with whatever that decision is. And what we're expecting in teams is to take some sort of input, some sort of processes, right? In our case, these are human capital. It's the traits that we bring to the table and put them through the actual work we're expected to do, the tasks we're expected to do. And ideally, this ends as some sort of cohesive output, right? Some actual success outcome. But this isn't always the case. What we've found a lot of the times is that it's a big balance between the number of people that we have on teams as well as the traits that we bring in. So I want to talk a little bit about people first right here. When we're talking about people, most teams are about 3 to 4 people that we've discovered with our research. And over at Blackhawke and Symeto, we have analyzed a little over 2,000 case studies of startup teams. And 3 to 4 is about the average, but will sometimes fall into companies that have 10 plus member teams. The reality is those 10 plus member teams have 2 issues really. One, they're operating suboptimally a lot of the times, but the other side is that they're not actually one team. They're several units working together. And what we've discovered over time is that 5 is about that number that you should be striving to have your team size in. We have several different reasons here that I've highlighted. I want to sort of talk about 2 of these, though. And the first is that motivation aspect, right? When we are working with other people, we are striving to silo our tasks and silo our roles in some way, shape, or form, where we can define what we need to do versus what the other individual needs to do in this team. And if we're looking at 6 or more members on this team, it becomes somewhat difficult to find that specificity in the domain. At over 6 members, we start sort of pushing out what these requirements are, these tasks are. It starts getting muddy. And so the motivation to continue thinking, continue working becomes lesser and lesser over the 6 number of people, because what this really means is that you don't have to be siloed. You don't have to think and carry the weight of thought through this process. Somebody else will. Somebody else knows what you need to know. And so the motivation to be the top tier, the number 1 in that area, starts to dwindle. In addition, the last point here of communication complexity is something that's drastically important. As your company grows larger and larger, the complexity of communication also grows exponentially. You can think of it as each person being a node and you being able to draw lines between each of those nodes. 3 people can only have 3 lines, but once you throw in a 4th person, there's 5 possible lines. And as you throw in a 5th person, there's 7. And it keeps growing exponentially as time goes on. And so the complexity of information flow in your company, as well as in your team, gets incredibly unruly and near impossible to deal with sometimes if we're not leveraging these traits and these communication practices to make up for it. Now, as I had mentioned before, entrepreneurial environments are complex, right? And some of us, when we are building into becoming a member of the C-suite, this is one of the first times that you've had to be a leader. Others, some of us, are coming from this corporate world where we've already been a leader in the past, but now the leader expectations are different. You have a little bit less clarity, a little bit less structure around that leadership role. And the steps that we expect to take to get to where we want to be, that success outcome, are complex, right? What we think are steps 1, 2, 3, and 4 are only the 4 steps until something goes wrong, or something changes, or a new technology comes out of the woodworks, at which point we have to be ready to pivot. We have to be ready to adapt and change. And so what was originally steps 1, 2, 3, and 4 might become steps 1, 2, 5, and 6, skipping steps, or altogether altering those steps. In addition to that point, we have the fact that it's a really dynamic world that we're in, right? With all of that pivoting, with all of that change, means that it is all the more important to be able to predict how we will behave, how we will act in those spaces where everything has gone wrong or everything has gone different. In these spaces where we've never been before. If you're in a highly innovative company, then every day may look completely different than any of the previous days. This means that if you're selecting roles for yourself and tasks for yourself, or if you're selecting other people to come on to the team, it's very, very important to understand what they might do, what they're probably going to do in those situations. The predictive power, if you will. Now, of course, we should all be familiar with various stages of startup growth, and how this changes throughout the process, right? There's ups, there's downs, and there's expectations, more important and priority tasks at each of these stages. I particularly like this graphic here because it shows several of the different models that we kind of progress through. And I want us to sort of really take away the fact that early stages require very different tasks than later stages, right? When we are in that growth stage all the way at the end here, that you no longer need to really hyper focus on developing things like the vision or the strategy. Instead, they should have been already ingrained and embodied throughout. This means that if we are looking at people with traits that are specifically good or specifically helpful to leverage during vision creation or strategy creation, they are less geared towards that growth area. But that's not to say that they're useless, right? It just simply means that where they're specializing, those traits need to be leaned on more so in one stage versus another stage. And if that's all they have going for them, we have to consider the fact that maybe they need to change their role entirely. Over those over 2,000 startups that we've analyzed pre-Series A, we found a couple of interesting data points, right? First, we found that was a lot of reports of decision paralysis. And this was costing about 3 to 7 hours per week, which equated to approximately 14% of their yearly revenue. We also found that people were reporting a large amount of negative interpersonal conflict between the founders specifically, as well as attrition and turnover. Now, these grow even greater, right? We see that the negative interpersonal conflict can cost up to 35% of your yearly revenue. And if we're looking at attrition and turnover, from the actions of hiring new people to onboarding them to dealing with the missing positions and oversaturation of the work, we can find over half of the yearly revenue goes down the drain just for attrition and turnover. The cool thing is, all three of these things can be predicted and worked around. All three of these things can be worked into the selection process, and they can be mitigated through the process of building effective teams. If you're a solopreneur, you can do essentially a cost analysis of yourself and be able to predict your likelihood of engaging in decision paralysis, or to find yourself not with an internal negative interpersonal conflict, but with external interpersonal conflict, right? Instead of working with your team, working with partners and struggling to see eye to eye with them. The key part here is that it's kind of a no-brainer that it costs money to have these mistakes happening. And measuring your traits, pushing forward, and really sitting and analyzing what your trait levels are and how they match up with other members on your team is key to preventing these costly mistakes. So here's our 12 pillars, right? From those 2,000 plus entrepreneurial teams, we've developed 12 pillars of entrepreneurship. And these 12 pillars are essentially groups of behaviors, right? We have vision, strategy, and resourcefulness. This is all around the idea of cognition, how we think, how we process information. And they're very key pillars, right? We think about what startups have, what moving companies forward are, and we realize that, of course, you need a strong and compelling vision. You need to have a cohesive strategy, and you certainly need to be resourceful to a certain degree. When we move past this, we find that there's a difference between thinking about these processes and being able to recognize these processes versus actually acting on those processes. And so in the actions category, we have execution, innovation, and decision making. And this is really the group of behaviors that's around operating and doing the tasks that you need to do, taking the strategy, taking the vision, taking the resourcefulness, and putting it into applicable states. With decision making, it's really about preventing that decision paralysis that I mentioned earlier. With innovation, it's about leveraging that resourcefulness. And with execution, it's about not just having the plan from the strategy, but knowing what steps to take when and how to optimally achieve it. When we move over to the relational area, this is where that interpersonal conflict can happen and where we can really measure and predict that interpersonal conflict. We have collaboration, direction, and influence. And influence is an interesting area because ultimately what it's looking at, it's measuring the aspects of how we handle the other members of our team as well as the external stakeholders. It's being able to have others see things the way you see them and act in the ways that you need them to act. Direction, it's a little bit more pulled back from there, right? Direction is basically being the captain on a whitewater raft where you need to ensure everybody's rowing at the right pace on the right side to get to where you need to go, just to make sure that the raft doesn't hit the rocks at the end of the road. And collaboration is really about working with others hand in hand. It's fostering the relationships and motivating and leading others. Now, all of this is helpful, but ultimately it's all for naught if you're not motivated to continue pushing forward. And this brings us to the last three pillars of tenacity, intensity, and autonomy. These three pillars focus highly on behaviors that are around motivating others as well as yourself, right? We have autonomy, for instance, which is largely around making sure that you understand what drives yourself, what ensures that you're capable of reaching the goals and standards you need to reach. We have intensity, which is really around the energy. How much of a battery do you have? And will you be able to continue drawing on that battery for extended periods of time? Or do you need to have periodical resting periods, right? And finally, we have tenacity. And tenacity is kind of that grit aspect that we mentioned earlier, right? It's about overcoming the obstacles. It's about pushing through difficult situations and being able to control the stress around those situations. So you can see each of these have very clear and very important behaviors associated with them. And all of these behaviors are predictable. We can predict how one will behave in any of these pillars based on their combination of traits. So ultimately, just to sort of sum up that process here, we have human capital traits that lead to the behaviors that then lead to the outcomes, right? And this is the predictive model that we're looking at. And what I'm hoping we take away is that even if you know what the outcomes are, but you don't necessarily know what the situations, what that person context is going to be, then you can still predict those behaviors ahead of time to a pretty high degree of efficacy utilizing the human capital traits that you have available to you. So if we were to put it into practice, right? If we were to put this all into practice, the process basically works like this. You should find a trait assessment that fits your needs. And I mentioned earlier, for instance, there's the MBTI, there's Hogan assessments, there's StrengthsFinder. All of these assessments function off a degree of traits, but not all of them are the same, right? Not every assessment out there is reliable. Not every assessment is even valid. The MBTI is notorious for not being particularly valid for anything past kind of just your own enjoyment, right? On their own website, they state that. But other assessments, such as Entrepreneurial DNA or the Hogan assessments, or even the one that I'm sharing with you today, have a much higher validity, much higher reliability, meaning that if you were to take it later, you're much more likely to get the same results again, and that these results are actually tied to some sort of outcome you're looking for in the relative or related area. So these traits aren't just tied to entrepreneurs, they're tied throughout the entire working process. Now, when we go to after our assessment, we need to be able to identify what those trait reports are, right? Are we high in certain areas? Are we low in certain areas? And what do those traits really mean? I mentioned earlier as well the idea of thinking back to some compliments or feedback you may have received, and think about the adjectives that they've used in the past. Did anybody ever say that you were empathetic? If they did, was it a positive or a negative statement? When we look at those trait levels that we've identified through the assessments, does that match up with what you've been told, what you've been given in your life? When we start doing that kind of process of thinking about how these traits might manifest in your real world, right, in your real life, your day-to-day, and thinking about the feedback you may have received, whether more formally or informally, this is the next step of reflection, right? We've assessed what they are, we've identified what is low, what is high, and now we're thinking about, what do I actually do in the day-to-day that shows this in the real world? The goal here is that you would take the traits and you would stack them up against those 12 pillars of behaviors, right? And you would measure and see, okay, if I am high in, say, I keep going back to empathy because that was in the middle of the screen there, but let's say we're high on empathy, then does that play out in one of those relational pillars? And if so, is it positive or negative for me? Being highly empathetic can be a good thing to a degree, but it can also be a bad thing to a degree. And that's another cool aspect of all of these traits, is that they express a relationship that we call curvilinear. Curvilinear relationships mean that they're very helpful to a point, but then after that point, they can actually be unhelpful. So think of being detail-oriented. Being detail-oriented is a brilliant trait because everybody wants to be detail-oriented. And so when you look at your report and you might find that you are 85 out of 100 on detail-orientedness, then is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, the wonderful part is that that is a good thing. It's not bad, because if you were 100 on detail-orientedness, that would actually be detrimental. You'd spend too much time. You'd be perfectionist in a lot of tasks and roles. You'd be striving and hyper-focusing on some of those details to the point where it actually hurts your performance down the line. So a lot of these traits that we look at as you reflect on them, you need to think about, is it too high or is it just right? Are people saying that I'm too empathetic and so it's stopping my ability to interact effectively with teammates or to lead? And this is something that many leaders struggle with as they take on that role, is finding that fine line between being cold and objective and being soft and subjective. Now, once we've done that reflection, it's about the application, right? You've reflected on how your processes manifest, how those traits affect your day-to-day behaviors. And you must now think about what needs to change. Which of those traits are not helping you and which of those traits are helping you? And what do you need to modify in your life to help the roles and the traits, the roles and the tasks better fit those traits? Here, this is kind of called job crafting, right? Where we sit down and we say, okay, what am I actively good at? What am I prepared for in the future? What are the expectations of this role going forward? And what can I do? And what might I not be quite prepared for? When we do this, we're able to help sculpt and delegate a lot of tasks that maybe we're not best at. This is also an opportunity to redefine what your role in the company is as a whole. This is where co-founders, for instance, may have to realign, should they still be CEO, CFO, CPO, etc. Should they even have been that in the start, really? Or are they kind of just pushing towards being highly innovative? We need to build out interventions that allow us to move these tasks, move these roles appropriately, and modify our behaviors that maybe are manifesting in poor ways. The last thing, of course, here is that it's all worthless if you do not continue to monitor the effects. So we need to ensure we need to ensure to build out the processes so that we can keep measuring the metrics that we have and collect the data. Because if we don't, there's nothing to be had. You don't know if you're actually making a correct intervention that's helpful or not. This builds into hiring, this builds into team building, this builds into job crafting, as I had mentioned before. Each of these are incredibly important, incredibly useful. If you're selecting people to come onto your team, then how do you know if you're going to select the right person for your team, the right co-founder, the right team member, the right C-suite member? This is usually done by running a job analysis, which I'll talk about in a little bit and help walk us through that. I want to ask you guys a little question here and open it up to the group as a whole, but have we had difficulties hiring people in the past or bringing new people onto our teams?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the question for you, Dane, too, is and maybe this is a question for the end, I'd love to learn, are these assessments good for each individual employee? Are there different assessments that you would take kind of with your co-founders? And I know we've done something similar with Cynthia and some of her assessments, but how do you really know? Because again, I'm a fan of it. I like it. I think if it takes even an hour of your time, it helps really show, and you kind of learn, something new about myself, my work style, how I work with others. What do you recommend? Is there one blanket one that employees can take and the co-founders can take, or that the C-suite should take versus individual ICs, things like that?
Excellent. And I love that distinguishing between the levels and the assessments. And the truth is, that's pretty spot on, is the fact that different assessments have different purposes. And we need to really read into what these assessments are giving us, what they're actually measuring. Now, the fun thing is that traits, such as the traits that I've been discussing, the human capital traits, these manifest at any level within the team, within the whether you're in C-suite or you're just a subcontractor, or you're hiring somebody that's entry level and maybe even an intern, right? All of these still have traits that manifest in some way. The power that hopefully I want to imbue us with here is that no matter what the actual insights are that you get from these assessments, you'll be able to understand the process of taking the raw traits that they measure, these assessments, and putting them towards some sort of success outcome, right? Because we might find that an assessment tells us about how well our team communicates. Okay, but if it says we're good at communicating, or if it says we're bad at communicating, why? Why are we good? Why are we bad? And the answer to that is always the human capital traits. It's the processes and procedures that we build around those human capital traits to ensure that more negative ones are mitigated and more positive ones are leveraged. Is there anybody else that has had struggles hiring or building out teams?
I know that I've talked to a couple of you that I think finding the right co-founder and the right initial C-suite is one of the most difficult tasks when you're starting your entrepreneurial endeavor.
Yes,
and I think understanding the human capital traits and the synergies between the entire C-suite is critical. But I know I've talked to a couple of you guys that have had issues finding a co-founder or finding that right person to partner with when you're working on your entrepreneurial endeavor. But I don't want to point out who.
We appreciate that. And certainly, right, we know that at the very start, if you choose the wrong co-founder to help carry your vision forward, it can cost you the entire venture, right? You can lose everything because essentially you put your money on the wrong horse. But at the same time, if you have the right co-founder, if you surround yourself with people who are effective at working with you and taking your ideas forward, then it's like the runway is unstoppable, right? It's impossible to not get to where you're going. And the human capital traits are exactly that. I love the idea of bringing this to specifically the co-founder question, because you're right. I mean, I've seen it a lot, say in the Gildre chat, for instance, but I also see it every day in my life. Whenever I work with other startups, or if I am in the middle of a research project, it's a non-stop issue that plagues startup communities. How do I find somebody I can trust? How do I find somebody that I can rely on? How do I find somebody that will challenge me, but not try to push down and smother what I have to bring to the table as well, right? And you have these terrifying stories of co-founders that have gone wrong, right? These choices that have gone wrong. But part of this is because of how we choose our co-founders. We don't usually run them through some sort of assessment. We usually ask them questions, maybe give them sort of unstructured interview, get a feel for how they work, get a vibe of their experience, and then decide, yep, we're hitting it off, let's go. But there's surprisingly very little predictive nature to the selection of a co-founder, even though the co-founder is something that will stick with you for quite some time throughout the process of the business development. So it's, in my eyes, it's a little silly that we don't typically do this. And this is one of those areas that human capital measurement and assessment is almost paramount to perform and do. We have a really good process over in Y Combinator, for instance, where they have a series of co-founder profiles that they build out, and they run a couple different psychometric assessments in the background to see how people fit and where they align. It's about measuring the drive, making sure that you both want the same thing out of what you're doing, measuring the relational pillars and ensuring that influence and collaboration are right there where they need to be, but also that if you yourself are high in certain traits, the complementary ones are being taken care of by the co-founder. Because the cool thing is, for all of those behaviors that we saw in those 12 pillars, you yourself, a single individual, do not have to be high performing in all of them, right? You just have to be high performing in enough of them and have your co-founder or some other team member, or even if you're a solopreneur, a reliable partner to be high in those other pillars, so that as a team, all of those pillars are checked off. And the only way to ensure that, right, the only way to ensure that all of those things are checked off and that they're appropriately filled out is by taking these assessments, is about leveraging these human capital traits and understanding what they are. And what about job crafting? I'm curious to see, has anybody joining us today had to shift their roles at any point throughout their process?
When you say shift roles, like move from like engineering into sales or product into something else, or are you referring to something else?
Sure, yeah. So it can be as dramatic as that, from shifting from one area of focus to another area of focus. It can also be more minor. Maybe it's pulling away from customer relations a little bit more, just overall realigning the tasks that you have to perform in your roles.
Yeah, I think that's a big one, because I'm also curious, and hopefully everyone on the call, whether you're a founder or whether you're right at a company, is how does the role of a founder evolve so much? One day, right, where we're selling customers, then we're pitching to investors, and then you're meeting, right, you're actually building the product and going through the workflow. So I'd love to learn how, if there's a science or what the process is, right, from different stages. When you start off, it's a lot about the product, it's a lot about customer interviews, user feedback, and then once you get to go to market and growth stage, you need to focus on those customer, the selling them, and then building that trust and retaining them. And so at which point, like, how do you use either human capital traits or these different types of surveys, or how do you have that conversations to understand, all right, on a team of 4, who's doing what, who spends more time on sales, who spends more time on customer retention, and what's the best way to kind of figure that out? I think for an early team, that is where everyone's traditionally doing everything.
Right. And I'll answer one of those questions right now, which is that at every point throughout this process, right, for every point throughout the business development, human capital traits are invaluable to be aware of and measure. If you're at the start, knowing who is the vision person, who is the strategy person, who is the expert at ideation versus application is key. And recognizing that maybe right now what they're particularly experts at isn't important yet, right? When we talk about product market fit, for instance, right, this is about the validation of the product. It's about actually putting the product in customer and user hands and having it teach us what we need to know about it to make sure that it has the successful market fit that we're looking for. And the skills and traits that are necessary to make that experience skyrocket are not the same that are necessary for, say, the early stage of ideation, right? You don't need to necessarily interact or collaborate on the same degree. The influence aspect, for instance, those behaviors of influence are not as important or even applicable until those middle stages of the company's life cycle. And so we find that it's really helpful to, one, remeasure yourself about every 6 months to once a year, and see how you've been developing over time, if any of your traits have shifted or adjusted based on your own actions and behaviors. And then on top of that, to, when you're bringing anybody onto the team, to find out what they are more inclined to be able to achieve. At what stage are they most important to lean on what tasks are they most important to lean on? If you, well, go on, yes. Oh, sorry, I thought I heard you start speaking. Now, with that additional aspect of who on the team does what, it's the same process, right? We look at those 12 behaviors and nobody is high on all of them, right? It's once in a blue moon that we find anybody that is exceptionally high in all of them. And if you are exceptionally high in all of those behaviors, it's actually a little dangerous, right? There should be areas that you do have weak points. There should be areas that you have strengths. You can't lean and do everything yourself. That's how we generate burnout. That's how we generate forced attrition, where we pull back, we lose motivation, we kind of end up quitting on our own venture because we're so exhausted from doing so many things that we weren't necessarily inclined to do, that we weren't prepared to do, that we weren't adequate to do. I think sometimes back to when I was doing my first venture, I had to do a lot of legal paperwork, and that was not where my mind was, right? I was not in like a CEO mindset, and I did not have the traits that prepared me for those. And so the best thing that I did was I located somebody who did have those traits, that were keen to reading through the legalese, keen to setting up and making sure that our not-for-profit was built out in the way that it needs to be built out, making sure that we were scaling in the right way that was not just optimal for our growth, but was also legal to grow in.
Dane, so we have about 7 minutes left. I want to make sure that we have enough time for questions. And then on top of that, I do want to make sure that everyone here understands the assessment that they should fill out after this, and then also the workbook. So let's actually first address that, and then we can do questions after that.
Exactly. So right now what we're opening up is a trait assessment for all of you. This is a trait assessment that was built through my work at the University of Florida International University, as well as in cohorts with my co-founder at Semeta, who spent a little over a decade at Gallup working on the Strengths Finder. And we put together this traits assessment in order to measure over 45 different traits and answer these exact questions that we see and these needs that you guys are seeing, right? We were building this out in order to predict successful traits. What traits predict successful behaviors, and what behaviors lend themselves to what actions at what time. And so what I would like us to do, and sort of the call to action for you all, is to go and take that assessment. And that assessment, should lead you towards these 3 actions, right? That assessment will also come with a workbook that helps you walk through and perform these 3 actions. These 3 actions walk you through what you need to do your job, what some of the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats are around your position, around your business, around whatever level you really want to take this information at, right? And if you're at a team, I'd strongly encourage your entire team to take this assessment and for you to sit down and have a conversation about how your different thinking styles or your different working styles might interact, and why sometimes there may be conflict or not be conflict, etc. And finally, of course, because it's all about projecting forward and making sure that we achieve things that we want to achieve, we have to tackle these SMART goals, right? So we walk you through the workbook how to build out your SMART goals that are specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-based. The assessment as a whole, it's online. It's about 10 to 15 minutes, though most people take about 7 minutes to complete it. And at the end, the workbook and the insights will be emailed to you automatically. All right.
Perfect. And just to clarify, everybody, the assessment link was also sent via Luma this morning at 9 Central, 10 Eastern. I also did put the assessment link in the password in the in-call chat too. So feel free to open up the link, do the password. It takes 7 minutes to fill out the assessment. But Dane, I'd love to open this up. We have a couple more minutes for questions. If anyone has any questions, feel free to ask.
Yeah, please. I know there's a lot.
Well, I have a question, Dan. I know that it takes some time to think about bringing on a co-founder, to bring someone on your advisory board. At Gildre, we think 90 days is a good amount of time to really get to know someone, to give someone some skin in the game in your startup. How much time do you think is a good amount of time to get to know your co-founder, an advisor, a partner, in order to bring them on to your business and give them equity in your startup? Before the assessment, after the assessment, because I know the assessment will give you kind of more knowledge.
Yeah, it speeds it up for sure.
Right.
And interestingly, the 90-day period is probably what we actually give with the assessment. And this stems from a lot of research that we've seen in the field of industrial organizational psychology about how long does it really take to show your work samples, for instance, right? To actually demonstrate your practice in addition to the predictive nature. And so what the assessment can really do here is it can stop you from wasting those 90 days, right? If you see that things are incredibly off center with these traits, that there's just no match with you two, you don't have to go through the 90 days to find that out through practice, which is typically what we end up doing. And you may recall one of the slides I had the cost metrics, right? One of the big ones, over 50% of your yearly revenue can go towards attrition. And part of that is the onboarding testing process. It's why it costs you money. You end up spending 90 days figuring out, does this person have what it takes? Are we working out? Let's start vesting them. And instead, you've just spent 90 days getting bad advice from an advisor, or building out processes that kept butting heads and having conflict with an individual. You can prevent that by doing one of these assessments beforehand and having a better idea of what you're going to see during those 90 days. So I love that we have that 90-day practice and recommendation, because it's exactly what the research does show, is that about 90 days is where you have seen the comfortable spectrum of performance and work samples. And vesting on the other end of that, right? We we see that vesting should probably be done throughout a 3-year process, which sounds really crazy, right? Like some people don't want to buy into a 3-year vesting schedule, but that ties into the commitment process, especially in a co-founder system. So that was some of the research that we were seeing too, is that 3 years is probably the perfect vesting schedule to have with co-founders specifically.
Awesome, Dane. We really appreciate it. Everybody who attended, thank you guys for attending. We do have our next workshop next month. I believe it's on May 15th with Coach Joel Olson. So I encourage everyone to attend that one. And yeah, Dane, we really appreciate another fantastic workshop. If anyone has any final comments or any questions too, Dane is in our Slack. If you want to send over your email, your LinkedIn for anyone to connect with Dane, please do that. And we really appreciate it. Our next workshop also is on founder burnout. So it is another kind of interesting psychological component.
Yeah, fits in really well.
So both these kind of go hand in hand, but really appreciate everyone for attending. And we'll see you guys all at also our speed networking event. It is later this week. So we'll see you guys there. Cheers, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.